Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. When Donald Trump lies, there's no more alert fact checker than my guest today. He tracks the 1,800 and counting false statements by the President of the United States. Now that's sad. My guest confronts his unusual propensity for bald-faced, malicious deception, fabrication, and outright ignorance. Daniel Dale is the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief, covering the Trump administration and other stories in the United States. He previously spent 4 years as a Toronto City Hall reporter and bureau chief, covering Mayor Rob Ford's administration from start to finish. And let's get right to business. How do you deal with the art of the lie?
Well, it's a bombardment of lies. It sometimes seems like there isn't much art to it. This is just what happens. It's an avalanche. What I try to do is confront it every single time, even if that makes me seem pedantic or obsessed, as I sometimes am called by the president's supporters. I think that the role of the media is to provide facts to people and to challenge the dishonesty of people in power. And so when the president says 103 false things in a week, as he did last week, I think, as many times of those 103 as you can point that out, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's in your articles, I think you should do it. So I just try to be vigilant, be alert, and be the guy that people can go to find out the truth behind what he's saying.
Daniel, is that 1,800 figure still accurate, or is it up now?
That's as of
the ballpark.
As of Sunday, I believe it's 1,829. That's an average of
as of June, almost July,
yes.
2018.
Yeah.
The president, via Twitter, via press secretary statements, or this discounts administration officials.
It's just him.
This is unusual. There have been nativist politicians, there have been racist, bigoted politicians, and there are elements of that in the Trump phenomenon. But this lie that almost refuses to disguise itself, I think of the Fleetwood Mac song, Sweet Little Lies. Little lies become big lies. How big are they becoming?
Well, there's this curious mix of big and little. So he's lying about needless things, like he said recently. He insulted Representative Mark Sanford in a private meeting of Republican members of Congress, and the Republican members of Congress didn't take kindly to this. They reacted, by all accounts, with groans and with silence. Trump tweeted. They responded with laughter and applause. That's a little lie. What's the point of that? We don't know. But he's also, telling quite consequential lies, about his trade policy, recently about immigration policy, blaming his own, family separation decision on a non-existent democratic laws. And so we're talking about policy matters. We're talking about his descriptions of himself, and we're talking about basically everything under the sun. Everything he talks about, he's frequently dishonest about.
The origin of Donald Trump's entrance into conservative Tea Party groupthink was that most vicious inaugural lie within this decade, which was to delegitimize the citizenship of President Obama. Why did not the press corps as a whole, you were alert to it, but why did the press corps as a whole not identify how troubling those lies were from their inception, both that lie and then his campaign announcement lies, which called Mexican immigrants rapists.
When he started with the so-called birther lies, he was still seemingly a marginal political figure. He was a loudmouth businessman looking for attention. So I think in the minds of, the White House press corps, people covering Capitol Hill, it was like, well, why am I going to pay attention to Donald Trump? I have serious issues to cover. So I think that was part of it then. I think when he started, he launched his candidacy and started lying, I think it took the press corps a while to adjust. I think they're still adjusting, but I think, especially at first, they weren't prepared to deal with a liar of this magnitude and frequency, because I think in part it was because, calling a liar or a lie, or even a false claim in news copy was seen as a departure from journalistic standards. I think it's fundamental journalism. The core part of our job is to point out what's true and not. And that means, not leaving the fact checking to the fact checker who writes his once a week column, on Saturday. It means that, in the story, when you're reporting on something a politician says, if it's not true, it's your obligation as a reporter to point that out. But I think, for reporters, weaned on this standard of objectivity and seeing objectivity as, reporting what the politician said, reporting what their critics said, and leaving it at that, this Donald Trump thing took a while to get used to.
And newspapers now, amid the second year, nearing the third year of the Trump administration, the headline writers have gotten with the program. They've observed that this president doesn't follow democratic norms. He dishonors his office by lying. We're going to say in our lead, this is a lie. We're going to say in our headline, the president falsely claims. Is that enough at this point? Should we be doing more?
Well, first of all, I think that more of that can be done. I think still too often, his claim is simply made the headline, and the falseness of it isn't pointed out. And that's, I think, particularly the case on Twitter. I just coming over here on the subway, I saw, ABC News, not to pick on them, but they tweeted out a quote of the president's from his rally in North Dakota last night, and he said, the European Union, as we all know, was formed to take advantage of the United States. That's not true. But the falseness of that was not noted in the tweet. So I think it's still, unfortunately, not happening enough that he's called out on these things immediately. As for whether that's enough, I don't think it's enough, but I don't know what more we can do. Our job is to provide facts and try to provide some sort of democratic accountability. We can't, arrest him from office. We can't shout at him. All we can do is report on what he's saying. So I think, our realm of possibility here is limited. I know it seems insufficient to many of the president's critics, but we are limited in what we can do.
Not just the president's critics, though. I think lay people, citizens who were frustrated with the president's dishonesty, with this administration's proclivity for dishonesty, its absolute lack of candor. We were discussing George Lakoff, the linguist, talking about needing truth sandwiches, much like we described, where you reassert the truth as opposed to repeating the redundant lie. And that's one approach. But another approach in the broadcast world in which you intersect, you're a print journalist, but you appear on television as well, is not to carry the open megaphone of lies that are the Trump rallies. And finally, at long last, networks and some cable operators have recognized that they're doing a disservice to their viewers if they air them, because they're just ad nauseum lies, ad hominem attacks. And so is that one approach too, because of the way that social media often relies on video, and where is video generated? Right here on the tube. Is that an important approach too?
I think so. I think that, given the frequency and magnitude of the president's lying, I think television networks can often be doing a disservice to their viewers by simply broadcasting him live. I think it's a hard call in the case of supposed policy speeches, and those are often interchangeable, as we know from his campaign rallies. But if the president says, I'm making a major announcement on such and such, I think it's understandable if networks want to cover those.
And he'll often say that and lie about that and say, I'm making an important announcement on tariffs, and then it's an attack on voting rights or something entirely different, or just him riffing
Yeah.
and attacking your native country president, Justin Trudeau, prime minister.
He does that, yeah. Or, he'll take advantage of the coverage he knows he's getting and do, 10 minutes of boasting, lying, and riffing before he gets to the
Because
policy
he
stuff.
doesn't do traditional press conferences. He'll entertain reporters, and that's really what he did during the campaign. He'll bring them in with the pool of photographers, and now the print journalists, the reporters and the photographers are going to these cabinet meetings.
I think it's largely good that the president often takes questions at these kinds of things. They're known as pool sprays in political journalistic language, and often, under President Obama and others, they frequently would simply pose for a photo and not respond to the questions on whatever pressing issues there were of the day. Of course, they were also doing press conferences, and that Trump isn't. But, I think Trump's engagement with the media in those forums is something to be admired. I think the content of what he's saying in them is often not something to be admired. He is, again, being highly dishonest. But the act of answering questions, I think, is good.
He'll speak off the cuff, but so much of that is proven to be lies later.
Yes, it's such a challenge. I think what journalists should do, they're all in a tough spot. We're all in a tough spot. I think something to remember is that he's very frequently saying the same false things over and over. And I keep track in my database on the Toronto Star website of how many times he's saying these things. Some of them he said 40 plus times, many of them, dozens of them he said 15 plus times. And so I think it's the obligation of journalists to come armed with those facts, know why what he is saying over and over is false, and be prepared and willing in that moment to challenge him. When he's standing in front of Marine One, the helicopter, or he's on that plane, go back and forth at him in the moment rather than leaving it to your story or leaving it to the next day.
Have those deceptions, deceits, the falsehoods, the lies, have they enabled him to destroy democratic norms? To what end is he lying?
It's hard to know how much he is succeeding because he is lying and how much is despite of his lying. The polling on his tax reform bill, for example, was very bad until after it was passed. This bill was underwater. The polling on the healthcare, Obamacare repeal and replace plans, about which he was frequently lying, was also very bad, and they failed there. On the other hand, the polling on the Mueller investigation, on which he's lying, has gotten steadily worse for Mueller and better for Trump. It seems like his lies are having some impact there. And so, I talk to some Trump supporters, and they tell me that they know he's lying, but they don't care. And sometimes it's for kind of curious reasons. Sometimes they say, I've had a bunch of people say, I like when he lies because he's messing up the elites. He's messing with their brains. And I like when he gets them running around scrambling and punishes those people I don't like. That's kind of a nihilistic view of political honesty that I think is hard for the media to deal with. But I think there's another view of his lying that's kind of rational. I talk to Trump supporters who say, look, I know he makes stuff up. I know, he exaggerates. But look, he put Neil Gorsuch on the bench. Look, he cut my taxes. And so there are things in this world that are more important to me than the president being honest. I think as journalists, as purveyors of fact, that can be troubling too, but I understand it.
How can he discharge his duties, including appointing a new Supreme Court justice, when he is constantly not being faithful to the truth?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a challenge for everyone, including Republicans, but Democrats, the media, voters. You cannot trust anything that comes out of this president's mouth. And I know that people felt that way about previous presidents, but talk to any historian who's been around for a while. We've never seen an avalanche like this. And so we broadly, this country is in a position where the man who's making huge decisions about the future of the country is making things up all the time about those decisions. It's tough.
One of the most I think troubling lies over the course of his presidency was about voting and delegitimizing or attempting to delegitimize the majority vote by insisting that millions of undocumented people voted, and that meaning he might have won the majority vote, which is false.
Yes.
That's tamped down somewhat, but To your mind, is that the lie that could potentially jeopardize our democracy in the long term more than any other lie?
That's a serious one. It's hard for me to rank them. I mean, there have been serious lies about minority groups that I think, you know, do damaging things to wider perceptions of those groups, and I think that's quite troubling.
And those work in hand in hand. The lies
Sure.
about immigrants and the lies about illegal voting.
Yeah, I think you know, it is damaging to faith in the electoral system when the president is saying that there is wide-scale voter fraud, that millions of undocumented people are voting. And I think, yeah, in the long run, you know, especially if he says similar things in the lead up to the next election, as he might well, I think it could do harmful things.
And ultimately, it will be Republican conscientious objectors who decide they, in addition to the press and the Democratic opposition, want to criticize the president for lacking honesty. Have you seen evidence, based on your coverage, that there will be any attempt on the part of the Republicans, or even the Republicans who were leaving office, like Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, to hold him accountable for his words in a way that they haven't thus far?
There are very few indications of that. We've seen, you know, occasional remarks by departing Republican members of Congress about the president's lack of honesty. We saw an op-ed by Mark Sanford, who the president lied about, and also, you know, whose defeat the president contributed to. You know, immediately after his defeat, he wrote a piece, I believe, in the Washington Post about how he was troubled by the president's attack on truth. But these examples are few and far between. For the most part, Republicans have contented themselves, resigned themselves at very least to this situation because this president is helping them accomplish their policy goals, and because they know that whatever they may think of the president's character, their own voters overlap with the president's voters. I think interestingly also, you know, Democrats themselves are not doing as much of their own fact-checking as you might expect. Certainly they do much more than the Republicans do. Certainly they're calling them out on a variety of things. But I think for a lot of Democratic members of Congress as well, you know, their attitude is we need to promote our own message. We can't get engaged in a daily tit for tat. You know, our role isn't to be fact checkers, it's to persuade people of our positions. So I think to a large extent, it's been relegated to people like me in the media, and the media itself is not as aggressive as I think it should be. So I think there's a sort of a truth void throughout the American political system.
A truth void. I was thinking about Flake in the context of tariffs and their impact on the price of milk or the price of goods, and the fact that that's something you can't deny ultimately. Go to the supermarket and you can hold up that fact. Another example for Democrats that I've cited on this show is you can go to bridges and tunnels and school buildings in this country and say, here they are. They're still broken. They're still obsolete. They're still the third world, because you're lying that there's infrastructure. You're lying that you were committed to redeveloping our transportation system. And so that's one example of where the Democrats, I think, can follow your example of speaking the truth and acknowledging that Donald Trump was a fraud in terms of being a builder. But when you say there's a truth void, do you think the press now are more in, do you think the majority of the press are cognizant of that truth void and therefore are not going to conveniently slip in tweets into every lead, into every teleprompter, and that there will be an unrelenting focus on the truth?
I think the media has gotten better at this, and certainly, you know, what the media, you know, aside from occasional errors, you know, what the media is writing or airing is truth. But in terms of holding the president accountable for his mistruths, for his falsehoods, lies, whatever you want to call them, I think there's still a reluctance to do it with the frequency that I think this president's frequency requires. I think it's being done for the biggest or most ridiculous or most obvious lies, but you know, he's saying this stuff daily. And often,
What about the recognition that Twitter is a lie machine? It's a lie production machine.
Well, I think for this president, every medium is a lie production machine.
But that has the fastest velocity, right? And maybe
it
the
does.
hardest to track and get to the people. And I encourage all of our viewers to follow you on Twitter,
Thanks.
where you are tracking these lies in real time.
I think, I think my colleagues in the press corps are doing largely a very good job. But I think, given the velocity with which the president's lies travel on Twitter, I think the media needs to match that with its own fact-checking velocity. Again, because he's repeating these things over and over, reporters have to be armed with corrections right away. The problem, though, as you know, is that, the people who receive the president's tweets, it's not a complete overlap with the people who are following myself or the New York Times or Washington Post fact checker. So even if we do issue an immediate correction, sometimes that correction is only traveling to our own kind of follower bubbles, and so that kind of mismatch between the president's base and in our quote unquote bases is difficult, and I don't know how to solve that problem.
In solving that problem, is there a difference that you find, one characterization of a lie versus a falsehood versus a mistruth, to be more effective in resonating with your readers?
Well, I think for the president's critics, it resonates more when I do use the word lie, and I see that in my retweet numbers, for example. I think there's a kind of satisfaction for people who are watching this and feeling like, am I going crazy, or feeling a sense of frustration. They feel like he's not being challenged or called out. To have a reporter use the word lie, I think can provide them a positive feeling. But I think even just pointing out that he said something untrue, I think, is often successful by the numbers as well.
We still are in that climate where a minority of Americans, but still 30% of the country, thinks that that is acceptable for someone, a president of the United States, to make a statement that when it's flipped or adjusted can then be interpreted as true. I wonder how you grapple with something like that, where the underlying condition of the lie may be accurate.
I think that, if we start letting those things go as reporters because there might be some underlying truth, then I think we're going down a slippery slope to a bad place. I think it's our job to take the president's words both seriously and literally and point out when the words as expressed are false. If a certain percentage of the electorate chooses to see an underlying truth, even though the claim is not literally accurate, that's their choice. But I don't think that we ourselves should relax our standards because of those voters, even if they're going to call us, pedantic or small-minded or insufficiently generous to the president. It's our role to interpret words as written.
And what about contextualizing it at all?
Sure.
To say, look, Donald Trump said this during the campaign, and the reality is if we were to judge employment by how many people make over a certain amount of money, we really are under or unemployed at a much higher level.
I don't think, I try to provide context where it's helpful, but often I think it's not helpful. An example from recently was, the president was claiming that homicide in Chicago is way up. And while homicide in Chicago is quite high, it's actually down over the last couple of years. And so I pointed that out. And then I had a barrage of his supporters saying, well, you're fine with this level of homicide. What he's saying is that it's a bad level of homicide. And so it's not my job in pointing out that it's wrong when he said homicide is up to also say, well, this is still an unacceptable level.
Right, understood.
So I think, if people want to excuse away claims that are not literally true, that's their job. It's not mine.
Final question, Daniel. The fact that these lies or deceptions are in plain sight, is that not what makes them so difficult to correct? Because they are overwhelming us, there is a malignant tumor of lie in the discourse.
Yeah, I think you identified a couple problems there. One is the frequency problem. If the president is saying one false thing a day, fact checkers and media outlets more broadly can thoroughly explain those, and they might have a good chance of registering in people's minds. When he's saying 3.5 false things a day or 15 false things a day, as he did last week, the chances of any one of those being remembered are smaller. And I think it's a similar problem to what we saw with the Hillary Clinton email issue during the election. She had one scandal, Trump had a whole bunch of scandals, but people remember that one because, it was the one that's being talked about daily. And I think, the other issue you identified is the president's ease with lying. It doesn't seem like he's he's being sneaky, that he's in a lawyerly, political, politician-like manner trying to sneak lies past us. It seems like he is being authentic because he's just talking, even when he's being hugely dishonest. So I think the issue of content versus manner is a difficult one for the media to grapple with as well.
And how do you not jump out the window after every rally?
I choose, maybe it's my instinct or maybe it's my choice, but I find them interesting rather than maddening. Like I was saying to someone on Twitter yesterday who was saying, why do you cover these things? It's just nonsense, it's just propaganda. I think these rallies are the best window into the president's brain. And I think by fact-checking, I think I can provide a kind of public service in response to this barrage of dishonesty. So I think I stay sane by feeling like I'm being useful in a way.
I was about to say, stay unmaddened, stay sane, Daniel. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.